Welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications before we begin. I want to warn you, this story contains mature themes. It deals with betrayal, infidelity, and choices that can never be undone. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop watching now. Some things in life leave you speechless. Not because they're shocking, but because they force you to see everything differently. They make you question everything you thought was solid. Everything you built your life around. This is my story, one I never thought I'd share. My name is Jennifer Dunlap. I'm 52 years old. I always believed that love, marriage, and family were like puzzles. You put the pieces together, and over time, the full picture reveals itself. It might take effort, but if you work hard enough, you get it right. I've been a wife for almost 30 years, a mother for 22. If there's one thing I thought I knew inside and out, it was my own family. The people closest to me. But life has a cruel way of showing you that no matter how much you think you understand something, there's always a layer you haven't uncovered. It started with something small. A moment so ordinary, I almost didn't think twice about it. But that's the thing about life-changing realizations. They don't always come in grand, dramatic waves. Sometimes, they creep in quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor at sunset. One day, I looked at my son, Damon, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. A resemblance, a trait, something I couldn't quite place. It was familiar yet foreign. The kind of thing that lingers in the back of your mind, whispering that something is off, but you can't figure out what. I shook it off at first. Chalked it up to overthinking, to my mind playing tricks on me. After all, mothers always see bits of themselves and their husbands in their children. It's normal, isn't it? But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Then came the comments. Casual ones, offhand remarks from people who had known our family for years. Friends, relatives. He looks just like, they'd start to say before catching themselves. Like who? It should have been nothing. A meaningless observation. But the more I heard it, the more it planted itself inside me. And once a seed like that is planted, it grows. I've spent my entire life thinking I understood the bonds that tie a family together. That love, trust, and commitment were the foundation of everything. But what happens when something challenges that? What happens when you start to question the very things you once thought were undeniable? Have you ever had a moment that made you question everything you thought you knew? I have. And it changed my life forever. Family has always been the center of my life. My husband, Aries Hobbs, and I built a home together, raised a son, and spent years believing we were on the same path. In many ways, we were. Aries and I married young. We were barely out of college when we stood in front of our families and promised to love each other forever. For a long time, I believed that love would always be enough. I believed that if we just kept moving forward, through the ups and downs, we'd always find our way back to each other. The early years were beautiful. We were partners in every sense of the word. We dreamed together, planned our future, and leaned on each other when life got hard. But love doesn't fade in a single moment. It doesn't disappear overnight. It unravels slowly, like a sweater pulled loose, thread by thread, until one day, you realize it's nothing but a pile of yarn in your hands. At some point, Aries changed. Or maybe I did. Maybe we both did, just in different ways. He became more distant. It started with small things, canceling plans, staying late at work, being physically present, but mentally somewhere else. I would talk to him, but sometimes it felt like I was speaking into a void. He'd nod at the right times, but I could tell he wasn't listening. I told myself it was normal. That this was what happened after years of marriage. People get comfortable, get busy, get tired. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. He wasn't just distant. He was distracted. Pulled toward something or someone I couldn't quite see. So, I did what many women do. I threw myself into motherhood. If I couldn't hold on to the man I married, I could at least pour everything I had into our son, Damon. And I did. From the moment he was born, Damon was my world. I was the one who rocked him to sleep when he was sick. The one who helped him with school projects at the last minute. The one who sat through soccer games in the rain, cheering him on, even when Aries was too busy to come. I gave him everything I had because, in so many ways, he became my purpose. And he grew into an incredible young man. At 22, he was strong, independent, and kind-hearted. He carried himself with quiet confidence, never one to seek attention, but always drawing it anyway. People were naturally drawn to him. He had a presence about him, something I always assumed came from Aries. I used to look at him and see pieces of our family in him. His father's determination, his grandfather's work ethic, and my stubbornness. I thought I knew exactly where he came from. But then, one day, someone commented. It was at a family gathering, one of those events where people stand around, reminiscing about old memories and telling stories that have been told 100 times before. I wasn't paying close attention when it happened. Someone, maybe a distant cousin, maybe an old friend of the family, looked at Damon and said something so casually that it barely registered at first. He reminds me so much of, they stopped themselves, laughed it off, changed the subject. I almost didn't notice. Almost. But later that night, when I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words came back to me. Reminds me so much of, who? I replayed the moment in my mind, searching for meaning in a comment that was never meant to carry weight. But the more I thought about it, the more it burrowed into me. Damon had always looked different from Aries in small ways. I used to brush it off, genes are unpredictable. But suddenly, it felt like something I had overlooked for too long. The resemblance to someone. Someone they wouldn't name. It was just a passing remark. A harmless observation. But it planted something in me. A doubt. A question. And once a question like that is asked, it's impossible to ignore. It all began with a conversation. I hadn't been looking for answers. If anything, I was trying to push the thought from my mind. The comment from the family gathering, the one that made me pause, made me wonder, had settled deep inside me like a splinter beneath the skin. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was overthinking. But doubt has a way of growing when left unchecked. A few days later, I was having coffee with Selena Gibbs, an old friend of the family. She'd known me since I was a child and had been there through every milestone, my wedding, the birth of my son, the years in between. She knew my family well, sometimes better than I did. We were catching up, nothing out of the ordinary, when the conversation shifted to the past. She started reminiscing, sharing old stories about my parents, stories I had heard before but never really thought about in depth. Then, she said something that made my heart stop. You know, Jennifer, there was a time your father was so proud of you. Always said you were the one who reminded him of himself the most. Said you had his strength, his way of thinking. She laughed as she spoke, sipping her coffee like it was nothing. But I felt something shift inside me. I had never thought of myself as my father's reflection. If anything, I always considered myself closer to my mother. But now, for the first time, I saw him through different eyes. Through Selena's words, I heard how much of him lived inside me. And suddenly, I thought of Damon. I thought of how, for years, I had searched for pieces of myself in him. I saw the stubborn streak I had as a child, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the resemblance that had always been strongest wasn't between Damon and me. It was between Damon and Deacon Briggs, my father. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying every interaction I'd ever had with my father. Every lesson he taught me, every phrase he used. And then I started seeing them in Damon. The way they both furrowed their brows when they were deep in thought. The way they always took control of a situation without being asked. The way they reacted when they were angry, never loud, never explosive, but calculated, controlled. It was unnerving. I had spent my entire life looking at my son, thinking I understood exactly who he was and where he came from. And yet, it was only now that I was noticing how much of my father had been passed down to him. The realization was bigger than just Damon and Deacon. It was about me, too. We inherit more than just physical features. We inherit behaviors, mindsets, and even the way we love. I started thinking about my marriage. About the way I had chosen Aries, a man who, in so many ways, mirrored the parts of my father that I had grown up watching. His quiet authority, his ability to make decisions without hesitation, his distance. I had always assumed that I was nothing like my mother, that I had made different choices and built a different life. But maybe I hadn't. Maybe I had followed the same path without even realizing it. Once the thought took root, it was impossible to ignore. I started watching Damon more closely. Not in an obvious way, but in the way a mother watches her child when she's looking for something specific. The way he spoke, the way he sat, even the way he handled stress, cool under pressure, just like Deacon. One afternoon, I saw him sitting in the backyard, deep in thought, the same way my father used to sit on the porch when I was growing up. It was a posture I hadn't seen in years. A mannerism so small it should have meant nothing. But it meant everything. I thought back to the gathering, to the way people hesitated when they talked about Damon's resemblance. Was it possible they saw it before I did? Was I the last one to notice? The doubt grew heavier with each passing day. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that there was no reason for suspicion. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't want to say it out loud. Saying it would make it real. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that something wasn't adding up. I had always assumed that genetics were straightforward. A child is a mix of their parents, their lineage clear and unquestionable. But what if I was wrong? What if the pieces of the puzzle I had spent years fitting together didn't belong in the same picture? What if there was a truth about my family that I had never been told? It all began with a conversation. I hadn't been looking for answers. If anything, I was trying to push the thought from my mind. The comment from the family gathering, the one that made me pause, made me wonder, had settled deep inside me like a splinter beneath the skin. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was overthinking. But doubt has a way of growing when left unchecked. A few days later, I was having coffee with Selena Gibbs, an old friend of the family. She'd known me since I was a child and had been there through every milestone, my wedding, the birth of my son, the years in between. She knew my family well, sometimes better than I did. We were catching up, nothing out of the ordinary, when the conversation shifted to the past. She started reminiscing, sharing old stories about my parents, stories I had heard before but never really thought about in depth. Then, she said something that made my heart stop. "You know, Jennifer, there was a time your father was so proud of you. Always said you were the one who reminded him of himself the most. Said you had his strength, his way of thinking." She laughed as she spoke, sipping her coffee like it was nothing. But I felt something shift inside me. I had never thought of myself as my father's reflection. If anything, I always considered myself closer to my mother. But now, for the first time, I saw him through different eyes. Through Selena's words, I heard how much of him lived inside me. And suddenly, I thought of Damon. I thought of how, for years, I had searched for pieces of myself in him. I saw the stubborn streak I had as a child, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the resemblance that had always been strongest wasn't between Damon and me. It was between Damon and Deacon Briggs, my father. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying every interaction I'd ever had with my father. Every lesson he taught me, every phrase he used. And then I started seeing them in Damon. The way they both furrowed their brows when they were deep in thought. The way they always took control of a situation without being asked. The way they reacted when they were angry, never loud, never explosive, but calculated, controlled. It was unnerving. I had spent my entire life looking at my son, thinking I understood exactly who he was and where he came from. And yet, it was only now that I was noticing how much of my father had been passed down to him. The realization was bigger than just Damon and Deacon. It was about me, too. We inherit more than just physical features. We inherit behaviors, mindsets, and even the way we love. I started thinking about my own marriage. About the way I had chosen Aries, a man who, in so many ways, mirrored the parts of my father that I had grown up watching. His quiet authority. His ability to make decisions without hesitation. His distance. I had always assumed that I was nothing like my mother, that I had made different choices and built a different life. But maybe I hadn't. Maybe I had followed the same path without even realizing it. Once the thought took root, it was impossible to ignore. I started watching Damon more closely. Not in an obvious way, but in the way a mother watches her child when she's looking for something specific. The way he spoke. The way he sat. Even the way he handled stress, cool under pressure, just like Deacon. One afternoon, I saw him sitting in the backyard, deep in thought, the same way my father used to sit on the porch when I was growing up. It was a posture I hadn't seen in years. A mannerism so small it should have meant nothing. But it meant everything. I thought back to the gathering, to the way people hesitated when they talked about Damon's resemblance. Was it possible they saw it before I did? Was I the last one to notice? The doubt grew heavier with each passing day. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that there was no reason for suspicion. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't want to say it out loud. Saying it would make it real. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that something wasn't adding up. I had always assumed that genetics were straightforward. A child is a mix of their parents, their lineage clear and unquestionable. But what if I was wrong? What if the pieces of the puzzle I had spent years fitting together didn't belong in the same picture? What if there was a truth about my family that I had never been told? I needed answers. The doubt had taken root, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't seeing, something buried in the past. If I was going to find clarity, I had to start from the beginning. I sat down with my mother, Lacey Zuniga. It had been years since we had a real conversation about the past. She wasn't the kind of woman to dwell on old wounds, but I knew if anyone could help me understand, it was her. We were sitting in her living room, the air thick with the scent of old books and lavender candles. I hesitated before speaking, unsure of how to phrase what was on my mind. Finally, I just said it. "Mom, do you ever feel like history repeats itself?" She looked up from her knitting, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" I swallowed. "Like, in families. Like we make the same choices, even when we think we're doing something different." She let out a slow breath, setting her knitting aside. "Jennifer, that's not just a feeling. That's life." Her words sat heavy between us. I pressed further. "Did you ever feel that way about you and Dad? Like you were reliving something from before?" She was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. "We all repeat cycles, even when we think we won't." Her voice was soft, but the weight of her words was undeniable. I wanted to ask more, but I could see it in her face. She had already said more than she meant to. That night, her words echoed in my mind. I started seeing my life in a new way. It was as if my past had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for me to notice it. I thought about Aries, my husband. The way he had become distant over the years, how he always seemed to be somewhere else, even when he was sitting right beside me. The way I had taken on the burden of holding everything together, convincing myself that if I just loved him enough, if I just worked hard enough, he would come back to me. But wasn't that exactly what my mother had done with my father? She had spent years loving a man who never fully let her in, making excuses for his absence, overcompensating for the void he left behind. And now here I was, doing the same thing. I had told myself that my marriage was different, that I had chosen a different path. But in reality, I had followed the same road. I had become my mother. Aries had become my father. And Damon was growing up in the same environment I had grown up in, learning the same unspoken lessons about love, distance, and silent suffering. Had I thought I could break the cycle just by wanting to? The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. Had I been so blind? Had I spent my whole life running from my mother's mistakes, only to make them myself? I looked back at my marriage and saw every moment I had dismissed, every time I had ignored the signs. The late nights. The conversations never went deeper than the surface. The way Aries had stopped looking at me like I was someone he wanted to understand. I had accepted it, just like my mother had. And worse, I had poured everything I had into Damon, not realizing that I was filling the space his father left behind. I had spent years overcompensating, trying to make sure he never felt the absence I felt growing up. But had I only taught him that this was normal? That love looked like this, like waiting, like sacrificing, like never truly being seen? The thought was unbearable. I had been so focused on finding the truth about my son, about his resemblance to my father, that I hadn't stopped to ask myself the real question: was this just life repeating itself? And if it was, how could I stop it before it was too late? It was time. I had spent weeks, maybe even months, trapped in my thoughts, piecing together moments from my past, from my marriage, from my family history. I had searched for answers in places I never thought to look, tracing patterns I hadn't even realized were there. But the truth was, no matter how much I analyzed, no matter how many memories I unraveled, I couldn't escape one fact. We had been avoiding each other for a long time, dancing around conversations that needed to happen, pretending we were fine when we weren't. That night, after dinner, I sat down across from him at the kitchen table. It felt strange, like I was about to have a conversation with a stranger rather than the man I had shared a life with for nearly 30 years. I took a deep breath. "Aries, do you even see me anymore?" He looked up from his phone, caught off guard. "What? Do you even see me anymore?" I repeated, my voice steady but laced with something deeper, something raw. He frowned, setting his phone down. "Of course I see you, Jennifer. What kind of question is that?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "No, I mean, really see me. The way you used to. Do you see who I've become? Do you even know me anymore?" He let out a breath, leaning back in his chair. "Where is this coming from?" I didn't want to hesitate. If I hesitated, I would lose my nerve. "I feel like we've been living on autopilot," I said. "Like we wake up, go through the motions, but we don't connect. We don't talk about anything real anymore. We don't even argue, because that would mean we care enough to fight." His face hardened. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I asked. "When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about bills, or schedules, or what to make for dinner?" He rubbed his temple, frustration creeping in. "Jennifer, every marriage goes through phases. We've been together for decades, things change." "I know they change," I said, my voice quieter now. "But are we changing together or apart?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared at the table like he was searching for something to say. I pressed on. "Are we just repeating what we were taught?" His eyes flicked up to meet mine. I could see it in his expression. He knew exactly what I meant. "My parents," I continued. "Your parents. We both grew up watching the same kind of marriage. Quiet, distant, functional, but not fulfilling. And we swore we'd be different." "Jennifer, we swore," I said again, my voice shaking. "And yet here we are. You barely talk to me." I fill the silence by focusing on Damon. "You stay late at work. We act like that's normal. But it's not. And I can't pretend anymore." His jaw was clenched. "You're making it sound like I don't care about this family." "That's not what I'm saying," I whispered. "I'm saying, I think we've been repeating the same cycles without realizing it. And if we don't face it now, we never will." Something in him shifted. His posture relaxed slightly, the defensiveness fading just enough for me to see something underneath, something I hadn't seen in a long time. He exhaled deeply. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "I don't even know when things got this way." The honesty in his voice cracked something inside me. I had spent so much time looking for answers in the past through my parents, my upbringing, my son. But the truth was, the real issue had always been here, between Aries and me. Somewhere along the way, we had stopped trying. We had let life pull us in different directions. And rather than fight for what we had, we just let it slip through our fingers. I felt tears sting my eyes. "I don't want to keep living like this," I said softly. "I don't want us to just exist next to each other." He nodded, his own eyes misty. "Me neither." For the first time in years, we sat there in silence, not the kind of silence that came from avoidance, but the kind that came from understanding. I had spent so long trying to figure out what was wrong. But maybe it wasn't just about the past. Maybe it was about what we did next. I had always believed that love could be repaired. No matter how far two people drifted, there was always a way back, if both were willing to try. But sitting across from Aries that night, I wasn't sure anymore. The silence stretched between us, heavy but honest. We had finally said the words we had been avoiding for years. The question now was, what comes next? I cleared my throat, my voice quieter now. "Where do we go from here?" Aries shook his head, staring at his hands. "I don't know. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the only truthful one he could give. I thought about everything we had built, our home, our family, our years together. I thought about Damon, the son we had raised, the boy who had grown into a man while we weren't looking. And then I thought about my parents, about the quiet endurance of my mother, about the emotional distance of my father. I didn't want that to be our future. But I also didn't know if we could fix what had already been broken. I took a deep breath. Aries, do you still love me? His head snapped up, eyes wide. He opened his mouth and then closed it. I watched as the weight of the question settled over him. Finally, he spoke. I love you, Jennifer. I never stopped. There was something raw in his voice, something real. But then, softer, he added, I just don't know if love is enough anymore. I felt something crack inside me. I had been so desperate for reassurance, for certainty, but there it was, the truth neither of us wanted to admit. Love had never been the problem. It was everything else. The years of neglect. The emotional distance. The silence had become our new normal. We had allowed love to exist without nurturing it, believing it would sustain itself. But love, left unattended, fades. I swallowed hard. Then we have to decide. Do we fight for this? Or do we let it go? For the first time in a long time, Aries looked at me. Not as his wife, not as the mother of his child, but as the woman he had built a life with. I don't want to lose you, he admitted. But I don't know how to fix this. I nodded slowly. Maybe we don't fix it. Maybe we rebuild it. The words hung in the air between us. We both knew that rebuilding would be harder than walking away. Walking away meant relief, escaping the weight of everything we had let slip through the cracks. It meant starting over, individually, rather than trying to salvage something that had been unraveling for years. But rebuilding? That meant work. It meant unlearning habits, breaking cycles, choosing each other every single day even when it was hard. It meant acknowledging how much we had failed each other and still choosing to move forward. I thought about Damon. What would he learn from this moment? If we walked away, would he grow up believing that relationships are disposable? That once things get hard, it's easier to leave than to fight? If we stayed, if we truly put in the work, would he learn that love requires effort? That it's not about never making mistakes, but about choosing to repair what's broken? I had spent my life unknowingly repeating my parents' patterns. But Damon didn't have to repeat mine. I reached across the table, placing my hand over Aries. We don't have to figure everything out tonight, I said softly. But we have to start somewhere. His fingers curled around mine, hesitant but firm. Okay, he whispered. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe we would fail. But we had chosen for the first time in a long time. And that was enough. It's strange how a single moment can change the course of everything. I used to think that love was like a road. Once you chose a direction, you followed it until you reached the end. I thought that if you built something strong enough, if you worked hard enough, it would last forever. But now I know the truth. Love isn't a road. It's a series of choices made every single day. And for years, Aries and I had stopped choosing each other. We had allowed routine to replace connection. We had let time stretch between us, believing that if we just kept moving forward, things would work themselves out. They didn't. Because love isn't something that exists on its own. It has to be nurtured. Fought for. Protected. That night at the kitchen table, Aries and I made a decision to try. Not to go back to the way things were. Not to pretend that we hadn't hurt each other. But to start over. To rebuild something new. The days that followed weren't easy. Old habits don't disappear overnight. It takes work to unlearn years of emotional distance. But for the first time in a long time, we started talking. Not just about bills or schedules or things that didn't matter. Real conversations. We talked about us, what had gone wrong, what we needed, what we feared. I admitted how much I had resented his absence, how I had poured myself into Damon because I didn't know how to reach him anymore. He admitted how overwhelmed he had felt, how he thought pulling away was protecting me from his stress when, in reality, it only pushed me further away. It wasn't perfect. Some conversations ended in frustration. Some nights, we still sat in silence, unsure of what to say. But we were trying. And that was more than we had done in years. I had spent so much time looking for answers in the past. I had convinced myself that if I just understood why things had turned out this way, if I traced the patterns back to their origin, I could fix them. But the truth is, understanding isn't the same as changing. Knowing why my mother stayed with my father didn't stop me from making the same mistakes. Recognizing the way I had overcompensated as a mother didn't undo the years I had spent filling the silence in my marriage with my devotion to Damon. Understanding is only the first step. The real work is in what comes next. In making different choices. In refusing to repeat the patterns that no longer serve us. In deciding every single day to build something new. One afternoon, I watched Damon from the kitchen window as he stood outside, laughing with some friends. For years, I had seen him as my greatest achievement, the one thing I had done right. But now, I saw him differently. I saw a young man who was still learning. Who was watching me, whether I realized it or not. Who would take the lessons of our home and carry them into his relationships one day. I couldn't change the past. But I could change what he learned from it. I could show him that love is something you choose, not something you endure. Real relationships take work. It's okay to struggle, but it's not okay to stop trying. That breaking the cycle starts with a single decision. And that decision starts now. If someone had told me years ago that my marriage would come to a crossroads, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have sworn that Aries and I were different, that we would never fall into the same patterns we had grown up watching. But life has a way of humbling you. Of showing you that love isn't immune to neglect. No matter how strong something starts, it will crumble if you don't fight for it. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe Aries and I will make it. Maybe we won't. But what I do know is this. For the first time in years, I am making choices with my eyes open. And no matter what happens next, I will never again let my life be something that just happens to me. I will choose. Every single day. What patterns have you seen in your own family? Have you ever caught yourself repeating something you swore you never would? Let's talk in the comments. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.